Stop the motorcycle! Don't take her away from me!
Stop the wedding. He is my debt's payment, not your husband. The billionaire signed the check, but the dragon stole the bride. The first time, Alberta felt the heat of a Ducati engine against her wedding gown. She felt nothing but fear, because she didn't know the man in the red racing suit was the only one who could save her soul. Kofi Mensah bought her future, but Jae-hoon Park came to reclaim his past. Kofi Mensah was old, he was powerful, he was feared, his influence stretched across continents, and the city's skyline was just a collection of trophies he already owned. His voice was a gavel, his signature was law, and his heart was a vault that had been locked for 70 years. Everything in his empire was under his thumb. Everything, except for a debt that couldn't be paid in gold. After a lifetime of cold calculations and colder conquests, Kofi decided he wanted one last masterpiece, Alberta Whitmore. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a debt paid in blood and beauty. He stood at the altar with a shark's grin, watching as the doors opened. He wanted a silent sacrifice. He got a war. But before the vows could be sealed, the scent of expensive perfume was replaced by the smell of burning rubber. A man who didn't belong in a cathedral, a man with tattoos on his hands and fire in his eyes, shattered the silence. Jae-hoon Park didn't come for the money. He came for the girl who had once shown a dying boy mercy. The white lace of the wedding gown felt less like a garment and more like a shroud. As Alberta stood before the vanity, the heavy silk pulled at her shoulders, a physical manifestation of the millions of dollars her father had vanished into the green felt of a poker table. Every stitch in the veil represented a promise her father, Daniel, couldn't keep, and every pearl on her bodice was a tear he had shed when the collectors finally came for his soul. "You look like an angel, Bertie," Daniel whispered from the doorway. His voice was thin, a frayed thread barely holding together. He didn't look like a proud father. He looked like a man who had sold his last possession to buy one more day of breath. Alberta didn't turn around. She watched his reflection in the glass. The stress had carved deep valleys into his face, and his hands trembled as he reached out to touch the fine lace of her sleeve. She knew what was at stake if she didn't walk down that aisle. The accidents Kofi Mensah had hinted at would become a reality for her father. "Is the debt truly gone, Papa?" she asked, her voice a hollow chime. "Kofi signed the release this morning," Daniel said, though he couldn't meet her eyes. "You'll be a queen, Alberta. He's the wealthiest man in the country. You'll never want for anything again. Except my life," she thought. But she remained silent. She was the good daughter, the anchor that kept her father's sinking ship from hitting the bottom. The memory of Kofi Mensah's cold, possessive gaze during their engagement dinner flashed through her mind. He hadn't looked at her as a person, but as a prize stallion he had acquired at a bargain. He was a man who collected beautiful things and broke them just to see how they worked. The heavy doors of the cathedral groaned open, and the scent of expensive lilies, the scent of a funeral, filled her lungs. The organ music swelled, a thunderous command to move forward. As Alberta began her slow march toward the altar, the weight of the veil felt unbearable. She looked at the guests, the elite, the powerful, all nodding at the transaction disguised as a ceremony. She reached the altar, her hand cold as ice as Kofi took it. His grip was a vice, a silent reminder that she was now his property. The priest began the ancient words, but they sounded like a sentence being passed in a courtroom. Alberta looked down at her bouquet, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was waiting for the end. She was waiting to disappear. Then the air changed. The sanctified silence of the church was pierced by a sound that didn't belong in a house of God, the raw, mechanical scream of a high-performance engine. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral didn't just open. They exploded inward, as a flash of crimson roared into the sanctuary. The scream of the Ducati's engine drowned out the organ's final chord, shattering the curated silence of the elite. Alberta felt the vibration in her very bones, a wild, mechanical heartbeat that stood in defiant contrast to the cold, stagnant air of the altar. Kofi's grip on her wrist tightened, his face contorting from a smug victor to a snarling beast. "Security," he bellowed, his voice cracking with sudden, impotent rage. But the man in the red racing suit was faster. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm, with a grace born of lethal discipline. Jae-hoon Park brought the machine to a skidding halt at the foot of the altar, the scent of burnt rubber and high-octane fuel replacing the cloying smell of lilies. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out a gloved hand toward Alberta. In his dark, focused eyes, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: recognition. Without a second thought, She gathered the heavy skirts of her white lace prison and stepped away from the billionaire's shadow. She took the hand of the man with the tattoos, and in one fluid motion, she was pulled onto the back of the bike. "Hold on," Jae-hoon commanded, his voice a low, steady anchor in the chaos. The engine roared again, and they surged forward. Alberta's white veil caught the wind, trailing behind them like a tattered flag of surrender as they tore out of the cathedral and into the blinding sunlight of the city. Behind them, the screech of black SUVs signaled the start of the hunt. Kofi's security detail moved with the precision of a private army, their sirens wailing in a desperate attempt to reclaim the billionaire's property. Jae-hoon leaned into the turns, weaving the red Ducati through the gridlock of the afternoon traffic with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. Alberta pressed her face against his back, her fingers digging into the leather of his suit. The city became a blur of steel and glass. Every time a black SUV drew close, Jae-hoon found a gap, a narrow alleyway, a sidewalk shortcut, a sudden dive into a subterranean tunnel that the larger vehicles couldn't navigate. He wasn't just driving, he was dancing with the chaos. Alberta felt the wind whipping her hair, the sheer speed stripping away the layers of the good daughter she had played for so long. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being led. She was being carried toward a horizon she hadn't dared to imagine. As they broke through the final perimeter of the downtown core and headed toward the industrial fringe, the sirens began to fade. The red blur was winning. The roar of the Ducati finally died in the bowels of an abandoned textile warehouse, leaving a silence so heavy it made Alberta's ears ring. The space was bathed in the flickering hum of mismatched neon signs, remnants of a forgotten era, casting jagged shadows of pink and electric blue across the concrete floor. Alberta slid off the bike, her legs trembling so violently that she had to catch herself against a rusted steel pillar. The white lace of her wedding gown was stained with road grit and oil, a ruined masterpiece that no longer felt like a shroud, but like a costume from a play she had finally walked out of. Jae-hoon didn't move immediately. He sat on the bike for a moment, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence that betrayed no panic. When he finally pulled off his helmet, his expression was as sharp and unreadable as a blade. He stood up, and for a heartbeat, Alberta felt the old instinct to shrink away, the fear of a powerful man that Kofi Mensah had spent months instilling in her. But Jae-hoon didn't tower over her. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he walked to a corner of the loft, pulled a clean, oversized black hoodie from a crate, and set it on a table near her. "The lace is too bright," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "It makes you a target. Change when you're ready." He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion, checking the perimeter of the room and adjusting a series of monitors that flickered with grainy feeds of the street outside. There was no aggression in his stance, only an intense, vibrating discipline. He was a man who lived in the center of a storm, but refused to let the wind move him. Alberta watched him from the shadows of her veil. She had spent her life around men like Kofi and her father, men whose power was loud, erratic or bought. Jae-hoon was different. His power was a choice. He was a predator who had decided to be a shield. As he methodically checked the seals on the windows and laid out a simple meal of bottled water and fruit, the cold terror in Alberta's chest began to thaw into a strange, wary curiosity. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice small against the hum of the neon. "You risked everything. Kofi will never stop looking." Jae-hoon paused, his hand hovering over a map of the city's shipping district. He didn't look at her, but the set of his shoulders softened just a fraction. "Kofi Mensah thinks everything has a price tag," he said quietly. He forgot that some debts are written in things money can't buy. He turned then, and for the first time, he looked directly at her, not as a prize, and not as a burden. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost he had waited a decade to find. The neon hum of the safe house felt like a pulse in the silence that followed Jae-hoon's words. Alberta stepped closer to the table, the oversized black hoodie now draped over her wedding lace, a strange armor of ink and silk. She watched him trace a faint, jagged scar that ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist, a mark that didn't match the clean, intentional ink of his tattoos. "You don't remember, do you?" Jae-hoon asked, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't wait for her to answer. 10 years ago, in the rainy season, a boy was hiding behind a dumpster in the alleyway, behind your father's old bakery. He was bleeding, hungry, and terrified of the men who were hunting him. He was a nobody from the streets of Seoul, lost in a city that didn't want him. Alberta froze. The memory hit her like a physical weight. She saw herself at 13, sneaking out the back door with a warm loaf of bread and a first aid kit she'd swiped from her mother's cupboard. She remembered the boy's eyes, dark, wild and trapped, staring at her through the downpour. "I gave him my father's scarf," she whispered, her eyes widening as she looked at the man standing before her. "And a jar of honey, I told him. I told him that the rain always stops eventually." A shadow of a smile, so brief it was almost a trick of the flickering light, crossed Jae-hoon's face. That boy didn't have a name then. He was just a weapon being forged by the wrong people. "But that night, you didn't see a monster. You saw a human being. You cleaned that cut on my hand and told me I was worth saving." He looked down at the scar on his wrist. "I spent the next decade climbing out of that alleyway, so I would never be helpless again. I built an empire, so I could one day find the girl who gave a stranger her father's scarf. When I heard Kofi Mensah had bought you to settle a gambling debt, I realized the world hadn't changed at all. It was still trying to break the only beautiful thing it ever produced." Alberta felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of grief for the girl she had been and wonder at the man he had become. For years, she had felt like a ghost, drifting through her father's failures and Kofi's demands. But Jae-hoon looked at her as if she were the North Star. "I wasn't saving you back then. Jae-hoon," she said softly, reaching out a trembling hand but stopping just short of his skin. "I was just being kind. In my world, Alberta, kindness is the rarest thing there is," he replied, his gaze intense and unwavering. "And I don't let rare things get destroyed." The silence of the neon sanctuary was shattered by the shrill, persistent vibration of Alberta's phone. It sat on the concrete floor, the screen illuminating the dark with a name that made her heart seize. "Papa." She looked at Jae-hoon, who stood as still as a statue, his eyes tracking the phone like it was a live grenade. Alberta's fingers trembled as she swiped the screen. The voice that came through wasn't the weary whisper of her father. It was the cultured, chillingly calm baritone of Kofi Mensah. "The lace is ruined, I assume," Kofi said, his voice dripping with a terrifying politeness. "A shame, it was a custom piece. But then again, so was your father's life. He's sitting across from me now." "Alberta, he looks tired. He tells me he's very worried about your safety." Alberta's breath hitched. In the background, she heard a muffled, choked sob, the sound of a man who had finally run out of luck and lies. "Don't hurt him, Kofi, please. He has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary, he has everything to do with this," Kofi replied, the sound of a heavy gold lighter flicking open echoing through the line. "He is the collateral, Alberta. You are the payment. A contract doesn't simply disappear because a boy on a motorcycle wants to play hero. You have 3 hours to return to the estate. If the sun sets and you aren't in your room, I will consider your father's debt unpaid. And you know how I handle bad investments." The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alberta looked at the black hoodie she was wearing, then at the ruined white dress peeking out from beneath it. The weight of the veil was back, heavier than ever, pulling at her soul. "It's a trap," Jae-hoon said, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't move toward her. He stayed in the shadows, his presence a dark anchor. "He knows your loyalty is your greatest strength and your only weakness. He wants you to walk back into the cage willingly. He has my father, Jae-hoon," Alberta whispered, the tears finally breaking through. "I can't let him die for my freedom. I'm the good daughter, remember? That's all I've ever been." She turned toward the exit, her mind a blurred map of sacrifice. But Jae-hoon stepped into her path. He didn't grab her, but his intensity stopped her cold. "You were a child when you saved me," he said, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "You didn't ask for anything in return. Now, it's my turn to be the good son. We aren't going back to surrender. Alberta, we're going back to finish the deal." The cold air of the warehouse seemed to vibrate as Jae-hoon reached for a heavy, lacquered box hidden beneath the floorboards. He opened it to reveal a set of ancient, gold-embossed ledgers and a heavy seal representing his lineage in the underworld. These weren't just papers, they were the deeds to his territory, the physical manifestation of a decade of blood, sweat, and strategic silence. By the laws of his world, moving these assets without the council's approval was an act of high treason. He was stripping himself of his armor to buy her father's life. "Jae-hoon, what are you doing?" Alberta asked, her voice trembling as she watched him stack the documents. "Those are yours, that's your protection." "They are just paper, Alberta," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You gave me a scarf when I had nothing. I am simply returning the favor with interest." He made a single, brief call. His voice was clipped, speaking in a dialect that sounded like sliding stones. He was summoning the elders of his syndicate to witness a transfer. He was stepping down, handing over the keys to his kingdom to the very men who had been waiting for him to fail, all to ensure that Kofi Mensah received a payment so massive that even a billionaire's greed would be satisfied. "The dragon doesn't bow," Jae-hoon whispered, more to himself than to her, as he tucked a small, silver burner phone into his pocket. "But he can choose what he guards." The transformation in him was terrifying and beautiful. The quiet strategist was gone, replaced by a man who had accepted his own ending to guarantee hers. He approached her, staying just outside her personal space, his presence a warm, protective wall. He wasn't acting out of a desire for war, but out of a vow that transcended the violence of their surroundings. "Kofi thinks he's playing a game of debt," Jae-hoon said, handing her a helmet. "He doesn't realize he's playing against a man who has already decided he has nothing left to lose. We go to the estate now, not as prisoners, but as the ones who set the price." Alberta looked at the man who was throwing away a throne for a girl he barely knew. The good daughter in her wanted to scream, to tell him to stay safe, but the woman she was becoming realized that this was his grit, his way of proving that some things were more valuable than power. As the Ducati roared back to life, its scream echoing against the concrete, Alberta didn't feel like a pawn anymore. She felt like the reason the dragon was finally taking flight. The rain began as a soft weeping, but soon turned into a relentless downpour, turning the narrow alleyway behind the Mensa estate into a canyon of slick brick and shifting shadows. Kofi Mensa stood at the center of a phalanx of black umbrellas, his silver-topped cane clicking rhythmically against the wet pavement. Beside him, Daniel Whitmore looked like a broken ghost, his shoulders hunched under the weight of a shame that no amount of rain could wash away. The low, predatory growl of the Ducati signaled Jae-hoon's arrival. He killed the engine, the sudden silence filled only by the rhythmic drumming of water on metal. Alberta stepped off the bike, her hand instinctively finding the hem of the black hoodie, her eyes locked on her father's hollow face. "3 minutes to spare, Alberta," Kofi said, his voice cutting through the rain with clinical precision. "I was beginning to think your new friend had a poor sense of timing. Now, step away from the bike and come back to the family you belong to." Jae-hoon didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into the waterproof pannier of the motorcycle and pulled out the lacquered box. He walked forward until he was 10 feet from the billionaire, the rain sheeting off his leather suit. "The girl is not yours, Kofi," Jae-hoon said, his voice steady, devoid of the heat that usually accompanied a challenge. "She never was. You wanted a trophy. I am offering you a continent." He opened the box. Inside, the gold-embossed ledgers shimmered under the dim streetlights. "These are the titles to the shipping lanes in Busan and the distribution hubs in Incheon. They represent the work of a decade. They are the foundation of the Park Syndicate's influence in the East. Take them, and the debt of the Whitmore family is settled in full. In exchange, Alberta walks away, not to a room in your house, but to a life where you never speak her name again." Kofi's eyes narrowed, the greed of a lifetime warring with his bruised ego. He looked at the ledgers, wealth that would dwarf his current holdings, and then at Alberta. To a man like Kofi, everything was a transaction. He saw the power Jae-hoon was surrendering, the empire being dismantled for the sake of a single girl who had once been kind to a stranger. "You're throwing away a throne for a baker's daughter?" Kofi asked, a cruel smile touching his lips. "I am buying back a soul," Jae-hoon replied. He slid the box across the wet pavement. It stopped at Kofi's feet. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Then, Kofi signaled his men. They picked up the box, checking the seals with practiced efficiency. "The debt is settled," Kofi said. His voice cold, he stepped back, allowing the umbrellas to swallow him. "But remember, Jae-hoon, a dragon without a horde is just a lizard in the rain." As the black SUVs pulled away, leaving them in the dark, Alberta rushed to her father. But Daniel wouldn't look at her. He pulled away, his eyes fixed on the ground where the box had been. In that moment, the true cost of the trade became clear. Jae-hoon had given up his world, but Alberta had finally lost the illusion of the father she was trying to save. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic drizzle, but the air remained heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and broken promises. As the tail lights of Kofi's motorcade faded into the mist, a profound silence settled over the alleyway. Daniel Whitmore stood trembling, his eyes darting toward the space where the box of ledgers had been, his hands still reaching for a safety that was no longer his to claim. "We're clear, Alberta," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic relief. He took the deal. "We can go back now. We can find a way to make this right with Kofi later, maybe." "No, Papa." Alberta's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that stopped Daniel mid-sentence. She stepped out from the shadow of Jae-hoon's motorcycle, shedding the oversized black hoodie. Beneath it, the white lace of her wedding dress was stained and torn. But as she stood tall, She looked more like a queen than she ever had at the altar. She looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not the hero of her childhood, but a man who had built a life out of other people's sacrifices. The debt is settled, but not by you. Jae-hoon gave up his life's work to buy back a daughter you were willing to sell. You didn't lose your way, Papa. You gave it away, one gamble at a time. Daniel reached out, his face contorted in a mask of practiced grief. I did it for us, Bertie. I did it to keep a roof over our. You did it for yourself, she interrupted, her gaze unwavering, and I let you. I wore the veil because I thought my obedience was the only thing keeping you whole. But tonight the veil is off. She reached up and unpinned the last remnants of the white lace from her hair, letting the sodden fabric fall into a muddy puddle at her feet. I am not your collateral anymore, and I am certainly not Kofi's trophy. She turned toward the street, where Kofi's influence still loomed like a shadow. She wasn't shouting, but her words were a declaration of independence that echoed off the brick walls. The cycle of owing and belonging that had defined her existence was snapping, link by link. She realized then that Jae-hoon hadn't just bought her freedom with those ledgers. He had given her the space to claim it for herself. Jae-hoon watched her from the bike, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a quiet, fierce respect. He didn't move to guide her or tell her what to do. He simply waited, acknowledging her as an equal for the first time. Go home, Papa, Alberta said, her voice steady and final. Live the life Jae-hoon bought for you, but do not look for me in it. She turned her back on the man who had raised her and walked toward the Ducati. She wasn't running away this time. She was choosing her direction. The city's suffocating grip finally loosened as the horizon opened into an endless expanse of sapphire and salt. The roar of the Ducati had long since faded, replaced by the rhythmic, therapeutic pulse of the Atlantic tide hitting the shore. Here, the air didn't smell like burnt rubber or funeral lilies. It smelled like cedarwood and possibility. Jae-hoon stood on the wooden deck of a modest coastal cottage, his frame no longer encased in leather or the stiff arrogance of a mafia suit. He wore a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that were now just ink. Not warnings. He wasn't checking monitors or scanning for threats. He was watching the sun dip below the waterline. His posture relaxed for the first time in a decade. He had traded an empire of shadows for a few acres of sunlight, and in the quiet of the morning, he finally found that his hands didn't shake. Alberta emerged from the house, her hair caught in the sea breeze, wearing a sundress that was hers, not a gift from a billionaire, not a sacrifice for a father. She sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable and earned. They had spent months stripping away the labels the world had forced upon them. She was no longer the souled bride, and he was no longer the dragon. They were simply two people who had survived the storm to find the shore. It's so quiet, Alberta whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. It's the sound of a debt being paid in full. Jae-hoon replied, his hand finding hers. Not with gold but with time. They knew the world back in the city hadn't changed. Kofi would find a new trophy, and her father would likely find a new game. But that world no longer had a claim on them. They had walked through the fire of other people's greed and come out forged in their own grit. Their story wasn't one of rescue, but of reclamation. Jae-hoon had opened the door, but Alberta was the one who had the courage to walk through it and never look back. As the stars began to pierce the twilight, they realized that true wealth wasn't found in a billionaire's vault or a syndicate's ledger. It was found in the freedom to choose who you wake up next to, and the peace of a conscience that no longer had a price tag. The cycle of the debt was broken, replaced by a promise that required no contract, only the steady, honest work of building a life worth living. In a world that treats people like transactions and loyalty like currency, the greatest rebellion is choosing to belong to yourself. Alberta wasn't saved by a man. She was saved by a memory of her own kindness, returned to her when she needed it most. True freedom isn't found in a billionaire's vault or a mafia's empire. It's found in the grit to break the chains of a debt you never signed for. Because when you stop being a pawn in someone else's game, you finally become the master of your own soul. Some debts are paid in gold, but the best stories are paid in grit. If you believe that honor is stronger than any contract, and that love is worth the ultimate risk, you've found your home. Hit that subscribe button and join the family at AfroKorean Grit Stories. Don't miss our next tale of silver-tongued villains, silent heroes, and the unbreakable bonds that bridge two worlds. Subscribe now, because every scar has a story, and we're here to tell them all.